Hello and welcome to this next session, which is on fishing and innovative technologies that can help us speed up the transition to sustainable fishing industries. I'm Hal Hodson. I'm the Economist's Asia technology correspondent, and delighted to be joined today by four excellent, very experienced panelists. They are Wes Erikson, who's the owner of Wild Pacific Halibut; Julian Hawkins, who is the chief executive of Vericatch; Darian McBain, who is the Global Director of Corporate Affairs and Sustainability for Thai Union; and Jenny Barker, who is the Chief of Party for SALT, which is the Seafood Alliance for Legality and Traceability. Thank you all very much for joining us. To kick us off, I would like to ask you in turn just to do a little mini intro of you and the work you do, and in particular just to think about how in your domain new technologies are helping to make this change, helping to make the fishing industry more sustainable, and the bits of that you're most excited about. And to kick us off, why don't we go to you, Wes, please?
All right, if you can hear me all right, I'll begin. So I'm a fourth generation commercial fisherman. I grew up in the industry from the age of about 6 years old. I've been on my father's boat and then purchased my own boat when I was 20 years old. I've seen big changes in the industry. In 2006, we went to a fully monitored, fully accountable fishery. I was involved with the advisory process leading up to that and all the trials and tribulations to get from where we were to where we are today. And since 2006, there's been a lot more acceptance to a fully monitored fishery, and we think of it now as kind of paying for insurance. With it, we've got the ability to prove ourselves innocent if any accusations are hurled at the industry. And it's fundamentally changed the way we conduct our business. We don't really notice that we're being monitored, but in the back of our mind, we always know we are, so we tend to behave when we're being watched.
Great, thank you. I look forward to hearing more details on the ground, or on the ocean, as it were. Darian, please tell us a little bit about your aspect on this.
Thanks, Hal. So I work for Thai Union, which is one of the largest seafood processors in the world. So we source globally, although we're headquartered in Thailand. And those seafood supply chains are really complex. So to us, technology means that we have better oversight of those supply chains. I often think of it as like a web, because there's so many different interconnections. And so when we start to look at electronic monitoring, allowing fishers to have access to technology so they can provide feedback, interoperability in traceability standards, it's really going to help drive change in the fisheries. And for a company like Thai Union, that's great for how we engage with our customers, with consumers, and also with regulators and civil society.
Fantastic. And Jenny, what about you? Where do you come at this from?
Thanks, Hal. I am the lead for the Seafood Alliance for Legality and Traceability, as you noted, which is implemented by FishWise. And FishWise has been partnering with U.S. retailers for more than 15 years. We partner with groups like Albertsons Companies and Target to look at more than 100 million tons of seafood annually. But we also think it's really important to take a broader perspective and a more holistic perspective on what it means when we say sustainability. And the way we do that through the Seafood Alliance for Legality and Traceability is to think of that as comprehensive, which means it has ecological benefits, it has social benefits, and it has economic benefits as well. And so SALT in particular is a public-private partnership between the U.S. government, and that's the United States Agency for International Development, the Walton family, Moore and Packard foundations, and really focused on promoting electronic traceability, promoting understanding around it, in order to increase its application worldwide.
Great, fantastic. And last but not least, Julian, Vericatch, the key is probably in the name, but tell us a little bit about how you guys are using the tech to try and meet these goals.
Yeah, absolutely. We go back 15 years, and Vera Catch has been focused on bringing digital technologies to catch reporting. But also increasingly, since catch reporting is quite often just for regulatory purposes, is trying to find extra value in that data, and so bringing that data into the supply chain. Because when people talk about sustainability, they're often coming at it from slightly different directions. So some people think of sustainability purely from the environmental point of view, but you got to think about sustainability in terms of the communities, the fishermen, the industry. How do you get to a point where the whole thing is sustainable, both environmentally and economically? And we think technology can offer a lot of solutions in that space.
Okay, great. So I'm really excited about this because it seems like we've got you guys are from all different levels of the sort of global fishing industry, from the sea all the way up to sort of higher policy stuff in your case, Jenny. But let's start on the ocean, Wes, with you. And can you just tell us a little bit about maybe how, not necessarily just yourselves, but how fisher folk, I don't know if that's the correct term, but fisher folk in general deal with kind of, how do you deal with resistance to what is essentially surveilling yourselves, right? It's not necessarily a comfortable proposition. How do you think about that yourself? How do your colleagues think about that?
Resistance, yeah, that's a good one. So fishermen, for the most part, are resistant to any kind of oversight. We're brilliant at finding ways around rules. We're lateral thinkers. We have to be in order to keep a vessel operating offshore. So incentives are how we get from A to B. Now, those incentives, when people think of incentives, they think of the carrot, right? But our incentive was more of a stick. It was a situation in which we were looking at severely reducing our fishery as a result of pressure from the environmental community. And so we had to come to terms with that. We had to find some way to be accountable and sustainable in such a way that the environmental community and the public at large, the Canadian public at large, was comfortable with our fishing practices. Now, how do we do that? We put together a process, and we get together and we try and define our objectives and then try and achieve those objectives. Now, that all sounds pretty straightforward until you get fishermen in a room from every sector of the industry trying to define and achieve some objectives. Well, we tried it for a year and we achieved absolutely nothing until we hired an independent professional facilitator. Now, hanging over our heads was the possibility of a full fishery shutdown. So that was our incentive. So we had to figure out how to solve this problem, and we couldn't do it on our own, so we hired a professional to help us figure out how to communicate to get from A to B. What that professional did was he identified our fears. Now, we'll throw out a million excuses as why we shouldn't become more accountable, none of which have to do anything with the real reasons, and those real reasons are fearful of losing something we already have or failing to gain something we think we deserve. And so an independent facilitator helped us to kind of mature in a process and achieve our objectives. That being said, it's still really difficult to, when you actually flick the switch and say, okay, we're moving towards this fully monitored fishery with 100% accountability and audited logbooks, man, it's incredibly frightening. So that first year, we dove into it, but we were scared. But like most fears, they were unfounded. We got through it, and we continue to get better at surmounting the obstacles as they get in front of us. So, that's it in a nutshell.
And just so that the folks watching at home can get a sense of the specificity of this, what did that pressure campaign look like? Are we talking about activists picketing your buildings? What did they want? What was their problem?
Well, the problem is unmonitored catch, discards, at-sea discards. And the truth of the matter is, for us to maximize our profitability, we discard. To get 100, when you're fishing a multi-species fishery, in order to get 100% of each species, you've got to start discarding. You might legitimately get 100% of one species, and we encounter between 50 and 70 different species. So you might legitimately get 100% of one species, and then all of a sudden you're topping up each other one and tossing the one you've capped out on first, right? So everybody knew that in the industry, but we're okay with that because we'd always done that. The environmental community, not so much. So they published a report which alleged that we were discarding, tens of thousands of tons, which was far more than I think we actually were discarding, but it got everyone's attention. And we thought we'd ignore it and it would go away, but it didn't. They lobbied government, and government lobbied the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans had some strong leadership at the time. And, they told us that, hey, you guys need a social license if you're going to continue fishing. Otherwise, you're going to see reductions over time, and it could really impact your bottom line. And that's what it's all about for us fishermen. It's our bottom line. So it got their attention, and they in turn got our attention, and we were put in a position where we needed to do something about it. So that was our incentive.
Gotcha. Yeah, Jenny, at Salt, can you tell us a little about the different kinds of incentives that you see more broadly across the industry? I mean, you've got a great example from Wes there of, negative pressure, I guess, or stick, as Wes calls it. Like, what are the other kinds of reasons that you see that the fishing industry can be incentivized to change for the better?
Yeah, it's a great question, and from our perspective, we kind of take a collaboration and learning approach to this type of problem. So the standard incentives seem to be obviously compliance with regulatory frameworks. With salt in particular, we're focused a lot on what we would call seafood producer countries. And that is more so in the developing world because we've identified through analysis that that's where the most assistance is needed, where the most capacity is needed. And so when we think about what incentives different countries or maybe smaller scale fishers in some of those places are, a lot of it is access to market, as was noted. And so when you have regulatory frameworks in the EU, now Japan, the United States government has the seafood import monitoring program, there is incentive in some ways through more of the stick, as Wes highlighted, to comply. But we've also seen different examples. Even in your traditional cost benefit analysis or return on investment, you will see there are a couple of studies out of Indonesia that showed better fuel efficiency because they were using a certain type of electronic traceability, or you would see a more rigorous analysis that show that over a period of time, maybe there's an upfront investment that is required with assistance, but there is within 6 months to a year some level of return. We also think, though, that you should broaden that consideration from traditional cost benefit analysis in the spirit of that holistic approach to sustainability. What are the benefits to using a traceability system, let's say, to help you with a stock assessment because you're tracking where the point of catch is, or what are the benefits to ensuring that there isn't illegal gear usage? The other opportunity is to consider the benefits from the sort of social responsibility or human side. Is there a way that this traceability data that's being collected could help indicate some level or show potential for risk in those supply chains? And don't get me wrong, traceability is not a panacea. It doesn't solve all the problems, but it is in fact a place where people are gathering data that could be used to think of benefits beyond the traditional sort of return on investment from an economic perspective. And so we are developing frameworks with partners to think through how those benefits get more broadly considered.
Gotcha. And Jenny mentioned Indonesia. That's broadly, very broadly speaking, Darian, you're part of the world in terms of operations. I imagine that I don't know, but I imagine that you don't see the same kinds of public campaign pressures in Southeast Asia over fisheries, but I could be wrong about that. As a sort of bigger, multinational company, what sort of pressures are you under to make these changes?
So I think as a global international company, we're also under enormous pressure. So a lot of this work started in 2015 when, for Thailand, there was a European Union, what was called a yellow card for illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing. So that very much speaks to the regulation of the fisheries. We had a global Greenpeace campaign against Thai Union that was looking at both environmental and social issues on the vessel. You had the US government rating Thailand very poorly on the Trafficking in Persons report, which had an impact on the fisheries. And you had major investigations from the likes of Associated Press and New York Times. So I can tell you, when you put all of that together, that's a huge amount of pressure to change. And Thai Union made the decision, I guess similar to Wes's story, that we need to address this proactively rather than allow this to happen to the industry. And so if I take the example of tuna, which was very much a part of the Greenpeace campaign, actually we source tuna from all over the world, so mainly from international waters. And Thai Union doesn't own any vessels, but touches on around 25% of the world's tuna fleet. So we set what we call our tuna commitment, which was to establish fishery improvement projects around the world. We're looking at 11 key fisheries from where we source tuna. And so that's really addressing the changes on the water. But we realize that technology has a very important part to play in that, and particularly through electronic monitoring. And so we're just announcing a partnership with the Nature Conservancy, so working with a major NGO to further our commitment to ensure that we have 100% electronic monitoring or human observers on our vessels in our supply chain. And that will really give us a window into not only the traceability, as we heard Jenny talking about, but also what's happening. You know, we're looking at using this electronic monitoring data to help monitor what's happening with Vericatch. We're looking at how we can apply it to human rights at sea. It will feed into our traceability systems. And so, again, as Jenny said, technology isn't necessarily a panacea, but it gives us an amazing amount of information that we didn't previously had. And when we have global customers and this huge supply chain, we absolutely need all of the data that we can get and ways to analyze it and make it useful, both for the sustainability of the fisheries in terms of catch management and harvest control rules, etc., but also in terms of the fishers who are working in those fisheries.
Yeah, I want to stay on that point of making the data useful. Julian, is there a way to sort of push these traceability using data to make the system more traceable? Is there a way to push that by presenting upside to the fishing community in a sort of, you know, if you track all of your fishing, you will get a better sense of where fish are or how to find them. And, you know, I'm almost kind of thinking like the ad tech model, where you get this really useful thing in exchange for this thing that society in general needs. A sort of, are there upside trade-offs that you see?
Absolutely. So I think you have to understand really where the fishing industry is coming from. Wes spoke about it earlier on. You've got basically a little bit of cynicism, a little bit of questioning, why does everybody need to capture this data? And fishermen certainly don't want to volunteer things unnecessarily. And it seems at times that lots of people are interested in what they're doing, and it can be quite oppressive. But that data itself can be used in lots of different ways. Jenny, I think, made mention that you might potentially save the amount of gas you need as a fisherman because you don't need to go quite as far in order to get a particular type of fish. We're working with fisheries at the moment that are trying to avoid choke or bycatch species by, again, sharing information as to where those species are popping up in nets. So there are lots of different ways that technology can be used. The question is always, for each individual fishery, they've got slightly different pressures, slightly different costs and interests. And I think it's a question of, offering up a bunch of different technologies and approaches and saying which ones of these can actually make a difference. Quite often we find with fisheries, it's also, and again, Wes alluded to this, everybody has got a slightly different point of view. So getting everybody all on the same page in terms of what's my advantage, why would I want to do that, and driving change is sometimes rather uphill, because if you wait for everybody to be aligned naturally, you'll be waiting a very long time. So what it often is, it's working with a few drivers who are interested in seeing if they can find an advantage, save some money, whatever it might be, or potentially even market their product better if they do something. And then as soon as they're successful and everybody else sees that advantage, then you'll see everybody else jump in and want to do the same. So we are seeing an increased pickup, but the ways in which the data is being used, still lots of different options.
And can I ask, I'm just curious with my nerd hat on, whether these systems for collecting data are essentially centralized or decentralized. Like if I'm a fisherman with one of these systems installed, is the data live streaming to some server somewhere where some fishing authority is watching it and they're going to come and bust you as soon as they see an anomaly? Or do I collect the data locally on the boat, and then if there's some kind of problem, then someone comes to me and says, show me the data from this date? Do you see the difference between those two models? I can see that the second one potentially, as a fisherman, gives me more autonomy, but perhaps at the risk of lower compliance. How do these systems actually work?
Yeah, there are a lot of different systems, and in the early days of any technology deployment, you'll find that all these systems don't talk together. They have different rules. Different countries have different requirements as to where the data could be stored, whether it has to be in country for sovereignty reasons, etc. And so getting that data, which is growing and growing and growing, into useful information, which was Darian's point, that's absolutely critical. So the fishermen, on the other hand, they don't actually want to have to be thinking about collecting the data. So electronic monitoring, which was one of the technologies that was raised earlier, it's great because it happens in the background. The fisherman doesn't need to waste time doing that. But the trick is, how do you get all this data together so that one system recording information at the same time as another one, that information gets cross-related to you and you can actually use it as coherent information? That's the trick of where it's going. And is that happening live? Is it happening maybe on a daily update basis? All of the above. Satellite internet is still relatively expensive. And so fishermen obviously have to be very wary of costs, and the cost of having live internet to your boat is expensive. So maybe it's the data waits until you come into port. Maybe it is live streamed, but only certain bits of it. It's not really at the point where I see many fisheries actually doing live streaming of multiple cameras from a boat 24/7. That is a lot of satellite cost, but maybe it'll happen in time.
And we've mostly been talking so far about monitoring that happens in situ on the boats that we're talking about. But my understanding is that there's a whole other suite of monitoring that is done by third parties that is more kind of like, we're watching you rather than you're watching yourself. Is that, I mean, maybe this is one for you, Wes, do you think that you and your colleagues are less comfortable with certain kinds of monitoring? Is there a preferred autonomous self-surveillance method that you would advocate, or do you think that it's important to be open to kind of any of these technical options?
Well, there's really no cookie cutter approach to this one. I think this depends on the values of the community and the fishery that you're actually dealing with at any given time. For us, privacy was a huge concern. We have a third party that collects our data. They audit it. They enter it for us, and if there's anomalies, fisheries violations, they'll report that then to the authorities. We were pretty nervous about the violation aspect of things, so we negotiated an amnesty for the first 2 years. Now, bear in mind, this was the first time this had ever been done anywhere. So, as far as the benefits of this program, we weren't. Nothing had been proven. So, we went into this with a lot of fear. So we put a lot of safeties in place, and one certainly was it not be used as an enforcement tool. But we got over that, and 2 years down the road, it is now being used as an enforcement tool at our request. So, yeah, I think it just depends on the values of the particular community you're dealing with at any time, and you figure that out through an advisory process. And involvement is the key to commitment.
Jenny, I saw your hand pop up there. Please do add.
Thanks. I think what Julian and Wes are referring to kind of highlights the breadth of different issues that people are facing when it comes to using technology in seafood supply chains. And part of what we did with SALT, and both Thai Union had been part of our original design, Julian had attended an event, was to look at and ask these questions. All right, all these silos of information, how can we make it clearer? You know, this is a big enough problem that no sort of one entity can do it alone. And when we went back and said, what are your data needs? What's the information you need to be able to commit to these types of systems? The community, the SALT community, which is about more than 1,000 people actually now, came back and said, we need to understand how to most effectively do something like a comprehensive traceability, and what are the best principles to do that. And so we consulted with 30 different sort of individuals from 20 countries to say, how can we highlight whether some of the key elements of pursuing these type of systems and getting past these pilots into something that is scalable? How do we actually start to learn from each other? Because you have really successful examples like Wes, whereas you won't have as successful examples in other parts of the world. And so for us, you know, it's really interesting, but once again, you don't start with the technology, right? You start with the design, like Wes said. You start with the advising. You start by understanding what data exists and how do you use that data to make your decisions. You start with a lot of different stakeholders and figure out their needs. You start by assessing your own existing systems, and you think about different ways to use that data based on the individual user's needs. And so part of what we've just released are these principles with this pathway to implementation, which should help people understand those sort of individual steps that you can go through to combat some of these silos of information or these small, just to really help people understand overall how to implement such a thing. And it will walk people through, you know, sort of an initial phase, a design phase, and an implementation phase. And we think that that hopefully fills some of those gaps in information that have been so prevalent. And it really does draw on the best practices from around the globe. It's FAO guidance, it's guidance from specific pilots that have happened in different places around the world. So we're really hoping that that gives some knowledge and information to support some people who are interested in doing these things, but are hearing all of these sort of conflicting sets of information. This can help them really drive and understand what their goals are in order to achieve the ends of more data and traceability in their supply chain.
Yeah, gotcha. Darian, Wes describes this kind of coming to terms with monitoring and initial fear about various things. And I guess I wonder whether the experience is the same or different at the different scale that you're operating at, the bigger scale that you're operating at with your suppliers. Are you at an earlier stage in that process? Do you have what, I guess maybe the best way to ask this is, what are your concerns at the moment about implementing tracing throughout your supply chains? What are you finding difficult or scary?
So we have the traceability, but at the moment, a lot of traceability still relies on paper-based systems. So you'd be quite surprised. Sometimes the fish can travel around the world through different ports and land in, say, Thailand for processing, and then be exported to its final destination market, and the paperwork is still catching up with it. So you've got the traceability, but it doesn't necessarily meet with the speed of processing and transfer. So this is where electronic traceability, and we work with SALT, but also the Global Dialogue for Seafood Traceability, can really help, having these key data elements so that you can transfer the information, but also system interoperability, which is absolutely vital. And to the point about, do people want monitoring? Not always, but I think particularly in a situation, as Wes described, where there has been some kind of adverse impact, then people start to see the benefit. And I can give examples from tuna supply chains, tuna vessels, where particularly there have been questions about how a fishery operates and they need to prove something. Then they're much more willing to have electronic monitoring stored on there. But also people want to know how their data is used. And I think that is very important, particularly if you've got pretty much constant electronic monitoring, almost like CCTV on a fishing vessel. You've got a lot of people's privacy and data, and you have to be respectful for what information is being gathered and how you're going to use that information. But if I look at a smaller scale, we did a trial in Thailand a few years ago where, I think to Julian's point, we actually did have some real-time sort of Wi-Fi connection on 4 different fishing vessels that we're working with. And that enabled the captain to both transfer the information, the catch data, back to land in real time, which, it could have real possibilities. At that time, the regulators couldn't take the information, but that is developing. But what we found when you had that Wi-Fi system set up, which is quite expensive at the moment, but is getting cheaper, then we gave the fishers a really lo-fi app that we called FishChat. And using that app, they could connect back to family on land. And this seems really fundamental, but is sometimes overlooked. If a fisher is out at sea for weeks or months at a time, we ask them, and it goes to the points about co-creation and understanding who you're working with. We said, who would you like to connect to? Do you want to connect to the police or an NGO? And they all said, we want to connect to our families. Some said they want to connect to their girlfriends rather than their wives, and we were pretty neutral about that. But it was getting that connectivity while they're at sea, and that's something that only technology has enabled us to be able to do. So it's a bit rare at the moment, but I think we'll start to see more use cases of that.
Well, I, for one, don't understand them at all. My favorite people to talk to were the police and NGOs at all times. But that's really interesting what you said about the regulators not being able to take this. It was kind of my next question, which is that it seems to me that at the end of the day, if you don't have enforcement that actually ever goes and asks for, tell us what you were doing on the 5th of November in this bit of the ocean, then can't whatever vessel just turn this stuff off or not write this stuff down at any point? Like, I don't see how you could ever get around that. Maybe Julian, this is one for you. You could set up a great system and it could be interoperable, but at the end of the day, if you come upon a mixed shoal and one thing you're supposed to catch lots of and one thing you're not supposed to catch anything of, it's very hard I would have thought it's very hard for the individual fisherman on the boat to not just be like, let's just switch it off, we don't need this hassle. How do you solve that problem? Is it solvable?
Yeah, it is. I mean, we definitely see the problem. I mean, some people today, they're monitoring locations of boats using AIS. AIS is actually a safety system. And so if people want to not be monitored and they turn off their safety systems, I mean, that has direct implications, for lives, right? So there are dangerous issues out there. I think a lot of fishermen, this alludes to one of the points Wes made, they actually want to have enforcement on agreed rules, simply because, everybody's got to play on a level playing field. And those rules are there to either protect the fishery or protect the fishermen. And so enforcement is a natural thing. As long as it's all agreed to how it's going to be done, it's all fine. And I think ultimately, if you're putting in a fishery management program, which is a structure whereby everybody agrees what can be caught, when it can be caught, what are the limits on size, and things like this, there has to be enforcement at some point. Otherwise, why would everybody follow the set of rules? But I think getting the buy-in from people as to why they would want to have the data collected, what data they accept to be collected, how that is being used, that's the critical piece. And technology gives us more options as to how that can take place, which for some people is scary because that's more options as to how technology might be misused. But ultimately, it should make the job easier. But I think there's another point that hasn't come up in the conversation so far, and that's this whole issue of wastage in the supply chain. The point that Darian was making about potentially having a live connection coming in from the boats. I mean, the ability for a skipper to communicate to port, hey, I've just caught this, valuable product. I want to bring it in now. Can you make sure that the market is all lined up for it? And the ability to, how should we say, tighten the supply chain with this information and reduce the amount of wastage in the seafood supply chain. It has both economic benefits for the fishing industry, and also, of course, it's entirely more sustainable if we're not throwing away seafood because it becomes out of date. So like all supply chains, if you put information in correctly and use it properly, there are benefits across.
That's really interesting. Wes, I want to hear your thoughts on this idea of just-in-time fishing, that as you fish it, we are preparing to sell it, and you don't even need to, we're scanning the fish's faces as they get pulled on board, and we're preparing the market. Does that sound good to you? Does that sound like overkill to you?
Yeah, well, that's just one of the benefits of the technology, right? That we didn't foresee. Yeah, absolutely. Once you kind of get past the fears, you start to realize the benefits, and that could absolutely be the case in high volume fisheries. Not so much in the fishery that I'm involved in. A simple phone call would achieve the same thing, but I could definitely see it in a high volume trawl fishery or high volume tuna fishery without a doubt. One of the things I want to add to this as well too is the technology is great. It's wonderful. It's evolving over time, but it has to be coupled with a robust integrated management system. Otherwise, it's just technology. That's so important that the two be combined. And back to what's been alluded to by a lot of the other panelists as well too is what do we want to achieve? So define your objectives, and then build around that. And these objectives change over time. Our objectives in 2006 are much different than our objectives are today. Today, there's social issues that weren't a concern in the early 2000s. Then it was just a conservation objective. So an advisory body, a dynamic advisory body in place to utilize the technology to its benefit is really key to making this all come together and work. And I'm sure everybody here is involved in some way, shape, or form with advisory processes that are dynamic.
Yeah. It seems to me that one of the bedrocks of all of this, as so often with tech stories, whether it's about a problem created by the tech or a potential problem solved by the tech, is about creating agreement on what anyone actually wants to do about it. That seems to be the starting point, regardless of whether you're going to use paper or gizmos. Darian, what are the fora in which these discussions and agreements are being forged? Where are these discussions playing out?
So I mentioned one before, which is the Global Dialogue for Seafood Traceability. So that has groups that meet within sort of the US, Asia, and Europe. And that did start from the basis of, well, what do we want to do on traceability? Where do we want to see it going? And it's been a very collaborative process for, I think, around 4 years now, and supported by multiple of the different foundations in the United States. And I think that's great as we roll these systems out. There's now a standard, the Global Dialogue for Seafood Traceability put out their 1.0 standard last year. And having the standard and being able to see what those key data elements are that we should all be transferring to the systems is very useful, but also the interoperability standards. And I'm sure that we can hear more about how SALT is also supporting that as well. I think another exciting initiative to talk about is CBOS, which is Seafood Business for Ocean Stewardship. So it's the 10 largest seafood companies in the world across wild capture, aquaculture, and feed, working together with science, such as the Stockholm Resilience Centre, to tackle some of these problems. And when you have these very large integrated supply chains, separate companies, but the supply chains all cross over. And in that group, you start to talk about things like traceability and how to end IUU fishing. Then you can start to see some really large scale change. So I'm really optimistic for the change that a group like CBOS can bring.
Jenny, I think apt to have the last word full to you on this. It seems to me like the industry is really only at the beginning of forging this the big consensus and smaller consensuses within that. What do you see as being the main talking points in over the next 5 years?
In some ways, industry, though, has led on this. And I think the unique place that SALT tries to hold, recognizing the success of some of the other industry alliances that Darian mentioned, is it's time to bring governments to the table more with industry, so they can be designing those goals sort of together. And so with seafood producing countries being more involved in that conversation, understanding the needs of industry understanding the data needs of different governments, we think that that's a really unique opportunity to move things forward on traceability globally.
Yeah. Well, look, we have run out of time. Somewhat surprisingly to me, that absolutely flew by as far as I'm concerned. I would love to be doing this in person and be able to retreat to the bar and talk more, but alas, maybe next year. We shall cross our fingers. Thank you all very much for your contributions. Really fascinating discussion. Only remains to me to wrap it up and say, Wes, Julian, Darian, and Jenny, thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, look forward to next time.